I was 32 years old when my grandmother's lawyer called. Not an email. Not a letter. A phone call at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the moment I heard his voice I knew. Grandma was gone. But that call wasn't about sympathy or condolences. That call was about a secret she'd kept for 43 years. "Ms. Elena," the lawyer said, and I could hear the careful distance in his voice, the kind attorneys use when they're about to change someone's life. "I need you to come to my office. Your grandmother left you something. Several things, actually. Documents you need to see in person." I remember thinking, what documents? My grandmother was poor. Everyone in my family said so. She lived in that small house outside the city, the one with the creaky porch and the garden she tended alone. She worked as a housekeeper. She saved what she could, but there was never much. That's what my father had always told me. That's what I'd believed my entire life. But my father lies. He's gotten very good at it. Let me back up. Let me tell you who I was before that phone call, before everything fractured and reformed into something I couldn't have imagined. My name is Elena Rossi. I'm the youngest of 3 children, the girl after 2 sons. In my family, that meant I was the afterthought. The accident. The one my father, Dominic, never quite looked at the same way he looked at my brothers. My mother died when I was 7. Cancer. I remember the smell of hospitals more than her face, which probably says something dark about my memory or maybe just about how young I was when she vanished. She was the buffer between my father and the rest of the world. After she died, there was no one to soften his edges. My father was a businessman. That's what he told people. What he actually did was extract value from places where value wasn't protected well enough. He bought businesses in decline, fired most of the employees, sold the remaining assets, and walked away wealthy. He did this over and over, each time with a new venture, a new scheme that operated just inside the law, sometimes with a foot firmly outside it. He had money. That was the singular fact of my childhood. Money and very clear preferences about who deserved his attention. My oldest brother, Anthony, was supposed to be his successor. Strong, ambitious, ruthless in the way my father appreciated. My middle brother, Marco, was the charming one, the negotiator, the person who could talk his way into and out of anything. They were groomed. They were noticed. They were expected to become something. I was expected to get married. That was the dream my father had for me, stated clearly and often. Find a good family, marry well, produce grandchildren, and essentially become decorative. I would not inherit his business empire. That was never the plan. I would become someone's wife, and that would be sufficient. But I didn't cooperate with the plan. At 18, instead of going to college to study business or communications or any of the useful for marrying things, I applied to doctoral programs in psychology. My father didn't speak to me for 3 months. My brothers made jokes about me being the family disappointment. Even my own grandmother, my father's mother, though I didn't see her much, sent a note saying she hoped I'd reconsider wasting my potential. I got into Stanford. I was furious enough with my family that I accepted immediately. Those 4 years away felt like resurrection. I found myself in California, far from the weight of Dominic Rossi's expectations, and I became someone I actually recognized. I made friends who were fierce and smart and didn't require me to be small. I studied the psychology of trauma, family systems, the ways people build narratives to justify cruelty. I learned that what I'd experienced had a name. Emotional neglect. Conditional love. Favoritism used as a weapon. When I graduated, I got a job at a community mental health center in Oakland. It paid nothing and meant everything. I was working with families who were fragmented like mine, and I could actually help them. For the first time, my choices felt moral. They felt true. My father did not approve. He cut me off completely at 27, after I refused to leave my job and move back home to get serious about finding a husband. I was making $42,000 a year, which in the Bay Area meant I lived with roommates and ate a lot of pasta, and I was happier than I'd ever been. The estrangement was thorough. I still saw my brothers occasionally, but even that was complicated by their loyalty to him. My extended family took his side by default. He was successful after all. He was important. Who was I to refuse him? And more importantly, who was I to him? No one. I was no one. Except to my grandmother. I need to tell you about Grandma Rose. That's what everyone called her. though her real name was Rosemary. She was my father's mother, which made her something of an outsider in the Rossi family herself. She wasn't ruthless. She wasn't ambitious. She wasn't interested in money or status or any of the things that made the rest of my family come alive. She was interested in people. She paid attention. She remembered small things. I saw her infrequently as a child, maybe 4 or 5 times a year at obligatory family dinners. But I noticed early on that she was different than the rest of them. Softer. Quieter. She had this way of looking at you like you were actual person, not a disappointing version of someone she'd imagined. After I moved to California, I lost touch with her almost entirely. I sent Christmas cards. I called on her birthday. Awkward conversations where my father's influence seemed to fill up the phone line between us. She was aging. She was slowing down. We didn't have the kind of relationship that could survive across distance and family dysfunction. Or so I thought. The last time I spoke to her was 2 weeks before she died. I knew she was in the hospital. My brother Marco had texted me a casual update, but I didn't call. I was angry at the entire family at that point, still in the raw part of the estrangement, and her illness felt like one more thing that belonged to them and not to me. That was something I would regret forever. But here's the thing about regret. Sometimes it doesn't matter what you didn't do, because someone else did it for you. The lawyer's office was in a professional building downtown. Glass and steel and the kind of expensive emptiness that always makes me feel slightly unwelcome. His name was Richard Chan, and he was kind in that careful way lawyers are kind. He had already pulled the file when I arrived, and he closed his office door with a precision that suggested this conversation required privacy. "Your grandmother came to see me about 8 years ago," he began. "She wanted to set up a trust, but she wanted to be very careful about how it was structured. She had specific instructions. She also wanted to keep it entirely separate from your father's knowledge." My heart had begun doing something strange, a flutter, a skip, an irregular rhythm that suggested my body understood something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. "She left instructions," Richard continued, pulling out a document, "that these materials only be given to you in the event of her death. Not to your father, not to your brothers. To you specifically. She was very clear about that." He slid a folder across the desk. It was substantial, held together with a brass fastener, and the label on the front read, "For Elena. Personal and confidential." That was my grandmother's handwriting. I knew it immediately. I'd seen it on birthday cards, on Christmas notes, on the single letter she'd sent me in California years ago when I was still in grad school. I recognized the shape of her R, the careful consistency of her lowercase letters. It was a handwriting that suggested someone thoughtful, someone deliberate. "Your grandmother was a woman of considerable means," Richard said quietly. "She left a trust fund. She also left documents. I think you'll want to sit down and read these yourself." I sat. My hands were shaking. In that folder were letters, documents, a journal, bank statements, old photographs, legal papers, deeds, the kind of evidence that only exists when someone has spent years, decades even, carefully building a case. The first letter was dated 8 years prior, and it was addressed directly to me. "Elena, if you're reading this, then I'm finally gone, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but mostly I'm sorry that I didn't have the courage to tell you this while I was alive. Your grandfather, my husband Robert, left me money. A significant amount of money. I've never told your father about it. When Robert died in 1978, he left me with $3 million invested carefully, designed to support me in the way he'd always intended. He was a good man, very different from your father. He believed in helping people. He believed in kindness matching. I've been very careful with this money. I've never touched it for myself. I worked as a housekeeper because I wanted to know how to work. I wanted my hands to remember what real labor felt like. I gave away a lot of money over the years to people who needed it, to causes I believed in. But I built the fund back up. I always built it back up. Your father has been stealing from his own family for 30 years. He created a trust fund when you were born, money from my accounts without my permission. He listed himself as trustee and slowly, consistently, transferred that money into his own business accounts. I've documented everything. Every transfer. Every false accounting. Every lie told to the family. That trust was meant to help you grow. Your grandfather wanted it to be yours. I've spent years gathering proof that it was stolen. I've spent years deciding what to do about it. I chose to tell you, Elena, because I believe in you. I believe in the person you've become. I've read your name on papers that came through my lawyer. I know you're helping people. I know you're living in a way that matters. What I want you to know is this. You are not nothing. You were never nothing. You were overlooked, but you were never valueless. The enclosed documents represent a legal case. Your grandfather left you $1 million in a properly established and maintained trust. Your father has stolen approximately $847,000 of that. I have copies of every record. I have recorded conversations. I have transfers, receipts, account statements. Everything a lawyer would need. I'm not telling you that you must do anything with this information. I'm telling you that you have the right to the truth. What you do with it, that is entirely up to you. I love you, Elena. I'm sorry it took me this long to tell you. Grandmother. I read that letter 4 times. Maybe 5 times. I sat in Richard Chen's office and read it until the words blurred and then clarified again. And I became aware that I was crying in a way I hadn't cried in years. Not angry, not frustrated, but something else entirely. Something broken. Richard gave me a box of tissues and let me sit with the folder. The documents were meticulous. My grandmother had kept records of every unauthorized transfer. She documented the original trust agreement, the amount my grandfather had left, the subsequent movements of money into accounts my father controlled. She had bank statements showing deposits that didn't match my father's reported business income. She had tax documents indicating hidden accounts. She had photographs of financial records, copies of forged signatures, evidence of accounts opened in my name without my authorization. She had also included investment statements showing that if that money had been properly managed and invested as intended, it would be worth approximately $1.9 million by the time of her death. What do? I asked Richard finally. That's entirely up to you, he said. These documents represent a strong basis for civil litigation. They also potentially represent financial fraud and elder fraud. You could involve authorities. You could pursue a lawsuit. You could do nothing. Your grandmother wanted you to have the information. What you do with it was meant to be your choice. I was silent for a long time. There's something else, Richard added. Your grandmother also left you the house. It's paid off completely. There's also a smaller account, about $200,000, that she kept separate specifically for you. She wanted you to have that regardless of what you decided to do about the trust. A house. $200,000. And the truth about who my father had been all along. I don't remember driving home. I must have driven. I must have navigated the streets and paid attention to traffic and done all the regular things people do when they're moving through the world with their eyes open, but their mind somewhere else entirely. What I remember is sitting in my apartment, that small one-bedroom I shared with 3 roommates in a creaky building in East Oakland, and reading my grandmother's journal. She'd kept it for decades. It started the year after my grandfather died and continued until about 6 months before her own death. It was a record of her life. But more than that, it was a record of her watching her son become a person she didn't recognize. There were entries about watching him dismiss people, about listening to him talk about his children, and the clear hierarchy he'd established between them. There were entries about the day he cut me off, which she learned about through Marco, and the careful note she made. Elena had the courage today to refuse him. That takes more strength than he'll ever understand. There were entries about her guilt. She wrote repeatedly about her own complicity, about the time she'd said nothing, about the way she'd been raised to defer to men and authority and the natural order of family power. She wrote about her marriage to my grandfather, and how his quiet insistence on kindness had changed her life. She wrote about realizing near the end of her own life that she'd spent too many years being silent, and that she finally had the time, resources, and leverage to change that. I'm going to tell her, she'd written. I'm going to tell Elena what he did. I'm going to give her the truth, and I'm going to give her options. After that, the choice is hers. But she will know. She will know she mattered. She will know she was worth something, and she was worth defending. I read that entry and understood something fundamental about my grandmother that I'd never understood while she was alive. She had loved me. She had seen me. She had spent 8 years of her life systematically gathering evidence to protect me, not out of obligation but out of love. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the documents until sunrise and then I called a friend, Sarah, who was a lawyer and who I trusted more than anyone else in my life at that point. "You need to talk to a financial crimes attorney," Sarah said after I'd explained everything. "Your dad's apparently committed fraud. That's serious." "I know," I said quietly. "Do you want to?" she asked. "That's the real question. Because if you do this, it's going to be a war. He's going to fight you. He's going to try to make you the bad guy. He's going to tell everyone you're ungrateful and greedy, and all the other things he's probably already said about you." "He's already said all of those things," I replied. "Then you're not losing anything," Sarah said. "But you might be gaining a lot of pain in the process. I want you to understand that going in." I understood. I did. But I also understood something else. I understood that my entire life I'd been operated on by a lie. And that lie had shaped everything. It had shaped my sense of my own worth, my willingness to accept less from my family, my belief that I deserved to be treated as disposable. My grandmother had died trying to rectify that lie. The least I could do was honor that effort. It took 3 months to prepare. 3 months of working with David Michaels, the financial crimes attorney Sarah recommended, to gather everything, to organize it, to determine the strongest way forward. During those 3 months, I did something I hadn't done in years. I started spending time with my brothers. Marco called me out of the blue in early spring. "I heard you met with some lawyer," he said. "Dad mentioned it." My stomach dropped. I hadn't expected word to travel so quickly. "When did he say that?" I asked carefully. 2 weeks ago." He seemed concerned. "He wanted to know why you were consulting with a financial attorney. He asked if you'd contacted me about anything." There was a quality to Marco's voice that I recognized. Hesitation. Uncertainty. He was trying to figure out which side to be on, and that hesitation told me he was open to hearing my side. "Can I see you?" I asked. "Can we talk in person?" We met at a coffee shop in between our lives, neutral territory, a place neither of us had allegiance to. Marco was older than me, in his mid-30s now, with the kind of charisma that had always made him dangerous to people and magnetic to crowds. He'd largely gone along with my father's version of reality, but something about Marco had always been slightly at odds with Dominic's ideology. Marco liked people. He was interested in them in a way my father wasn't. I brought copies of the documents. I laid them out on the coffee shop table like evidence at a trial, which I suppose they were. I showed him the bank statements, the forged signatures, the transfers. I told him about the trust fund, about how our grandfather had left me money and our father had stolen it. Marco read everything slowly and carefully, and I watched his face go through a series of transformations. Confusion, anger, then something that looked like recognition. "He always said you were ungrateful," Marco said finally. "He always said you were rejecting him out of spite. He made it sound like you didn't appreciate what he'd given you." "He gave me nothing," I said quietly. "That's the point. He took what belonged to me and then punished me for not having it." "How much did Grandma leave?" Marco asked. "Almost $2 million. Plus the house." Marco let out a laugh that was equal parts genuine amusement and something darker. "Jesus. He's been so paranoid about money for years, and meanwhile he was covering this up. Do you know how much money he has?" "Actually has." I shook my head. "Tens of millions. Maybe more. And he's still angry about a trust fund that technically wasn't even his. That was never even on his plate." "He was angry because I wouldn't let him control me," I said. "The money was just the excuse." Marco was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'll help you. I'll testify. I'll give you whatever you need." He's been increasingly erratic for years, and I think on some level I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to know, you know? I didn't want to see it. I knew. I did. And I was grateful to him for changing his mind. Anthony was harder. Anthony was more like our father, and the truth about Dominic was harder for him to accept because it implicated his own choices, his own allegiance. But I tried anyway. I met him at the same coffee shop, brought the same documents, laid out the same case. Anthony read them with the expression of someone reading something he wanted to dismiss but couldn't quite. "Why are you telling me this?" he finally asked. "Because you're my brother," I said. "Because you deserve to know the truth about our father. Because whatever happens next, you should make your choices based on facts, not on faith." "And what's happening next?" Anthony asked. "I'm filing a lawsuit," I said. "I'm seeking restitution for the stolen trust fund and for my grandfather's intended legacy. The documents are strong enough to probably win. When I do, it's going to be very public, and it's going to be very ugly." Anthony pushed the documents away from him, as though they were contaminated. "I don't want to know this," he said. "I'm serious, Elena. I don't want to know this." "You already know it," I replied gently. "You just have to decide whether you're going to acknowledge it or pretend it doesn't exist." He made his choice then and there. He got up and walked away. I didn't blame him. Denial was a comfortable place to live, and accepting the truth about Dominic Rossi would have required him to accept the truth about himself, about the things he'd been willing to accept, about the prices he'd paid for maintaining that comfortable denial. Marco was enough. I had Marco, and I had the documents, and I had a lawyer who believed the case was strong enough to win. The lawsuit was filed on a Tuesday in early June. I remember the date because I'd taken the day off work and I'd gone to David's office and I'd signed the papers with a hand that felt strange, like it belonged to someone else, some version of me that had decided to become brave. The papers were served to my father at his office that afternoon. I wasn't there to see it, but David told me that Dominic's response had been immediate and explosive. He'd called David's office demanding to know what was going on, threatening legal action against me for slander and defamation, claiming that the documents were forged and that I was a vindictive, ungrateful daughter trying to destroy him out of spite. "He'll likely retain counsel and counterfile," David said calmly. "He'll demand discovery. He'll probably try to claim the documents are falsified. But Elena, I've reviewed everything your grandmother left you. It's solid. It's more than solid. It's airtight." I believed him. But I also understood that solid evidence and family truth are not the same thing. And I understood that my father would be willing to go to war to defend the version of reality he'd constructed. The call came 3 days later. My father's attorney, a man I'd never met named Harris Whitmore, called David to propose a settlement. "Your client has some serious allegations," David told me. "But Mr. Rossi's attorney is opening with an offer of $300,000 and a settlement that includes a non-disparagement clause." "No," I said. "Even if the court awards more, there are no guarantees," David said carefully. "A settlement is." "No," I said again. "I'm not settling. I want him to have to face this. I want him to have to go to trial." David looked uncomfortable. Trials are unpredictable. They're also expensive and emotionally demanding. "I know," I said. "But if we settle now, he gets to keep the story that I did this for money. He gets to tell everyone I'm materialistic and greedy, and that I'm his ungrateful daughter trying to shake him down. If we go to trial, the truth comes out in public. Everyone knows what he did." David nodded slowly. "You understand this might backfire? You understand that some people will believe him no matter what the documents say?" "Yes," I said. "But some people will know the truth. That's what matters to me." The discovery process was brutal. It required me to relive years of emotional neglect, to revisit the specific moments where I was told I was valueless, to articulate in legal documents the damage that had been done to me. I had to produce emails, text messages, records of conversations. I had to have my hurt witnessed by lawyers and paralegals and everyone on my father's legal team. My father, in turn, had to produce his financial records. He had to answer questions under oath. He had to explain the transfers, the accounts, the movements of money that had no logical explanation if he was being honest. He wasn't. He claimed the documents were forged by my grandmother. He claimed she was mentally unstable in her later years and had become obsessed with false narratives about him. He claimed that I, as her vulnerable granddaughter, had been manipulated by her delusions into believing that I was the victim of financial crimes that had never occurred. It was the same thing he'd always done. Reframe the truth as a lie, and the victim as the perpetrator. But then the trial date arrived. Let me tell you about the week of trial. Let me tell you what it feels like to sit in a courtroom across from the man who raised you, who told you that you were not enough, and watch him try to rewrite the narrative of your entire life. The trial was in August, 3 months after the lawsuit was filed. The courtroom was small and professional, with the kind of wood paneling that's meant to suggest stability and truth. My father sat at a table with his attorney, and he wore an expression of wounded dignity, as though all of this was deeply offensive to him, as though he was a man being unfairly attacked. I sat at a table with David, and I brought with me the evidence my grandmother had left. Physical documents, bank statements, photographs, the journal. All of it. The prosecutor, because this was civil court, but the fraud was significant enough that the state was also pursuing criminal charges, presented the case first. She was a woman named Ruth Patterson, and she was methodical and thorough in a way that reminded me of my grandmother. She gathered evidence the way my grandmother had gathered it. Careful, strategic, irrefutable. She showed the courtroom the original trust agreement, dated 1980, establishing the $1 million trust for me. She showed the transfers out of that account. She showed the forged signatures. She showed the record of fake accounting my father had maintained to make it appear the money had been spent on my upbringing, when in fact none of it had been. She called me to testify. I sat in the witness box and I answered questions about my childhood. I talked about the favoritism my brothers had experienced. I talked about being told to be quiet, to be grateful for less, to accept being treated as peripheral. I talked about the estrangement, and how my father had punished me for refusing to live according to his design. Do you remember a conversation with your father when you were 27? Ruth asked. Yes, I said. He told me I was throwing my life away, and that I was a disappointment to the family. He said that he was cutting me off financially, and he also said, I paused, not sure I could say this without shaking. He said that he'd wasted enough money on me, and that he wouldn't waste any more. Had he actually spent money on you? After age 18? No, I said. I'd put myself through college and then through graduate school. I was living on my own and supporting myself. He hadn't spent a dime on me since I was 18 years old. But he was claiming that the trust money he'd stolen was what had funded my life. Ruth nodded and moved on to other questions, but the point had been made clear. My father hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen money and then used that theft as justification for emotional cruelty. The cross-examination was worse. Dominic's attorney, Harris Whitmore, was extremely good at what he did, which was making me sound like I was the one doing something wrong. Isn't it true that you've been estranged from your family for 5 years? He asked. Yes, I said. And isn't it true that that estrangement was a result of your refusal to accept your father's guidance? It was a result of my refusal to let him control my life, I said carefully. Isn't it true that during this 5-year estrangement, your animosity toward your father has grown? My animosity toward my father comes from the way he's treated me, I said. Not from absence. From what actually happened. Your grandmother left you money, didn't she? Approximately $200,000. Yes, I said. And now you're claiming that your father stole almost $2 million from you. And you're seeking restitution. Isn't it convenient that you've discovered this theft now that your grandmother is dead and cannot refute your claims? I felt myself go cold. The implication was clear. I was a greedy daughter who'd seized on her grandmother's death as an opportunity to extort her father. My grandmother didn't refute the claims, I said quietly. She spent 8 years documenting them. She spent 8 years gathering evidence. And she did it because she believed I deserved to know the truth. But you didn't know your grandmother well, did you? Harris pressed. You rarely saw her. You didn't maintain a close relationship with her. No, I said. I didn't. But she maintained a relationship with me from a distance. She paid attention to my life. She was watching out for me even when I didn't know it. My father testified on the second day. He sat in the witness box and told a story that was technically accurate in places and profoundly dishonest in its entirety. He talked about his struggles as a businessman, about the money he'd earned through hard work, about how he'd invested in his son's futures, and how they'd been grateful for that investment. He talked about me with a kind of performative sadness, as though my existence had been a disappointment and a burden he'd borne with dignity. I did everything I could to support Elena, he said, and his voice carried a note of hurt, as though he'd been the victim all along. I provided her with every opportunity. I hoped she would value what I was offering her. Instead, she rejected me. She rejected the family. She decided to throw away everything and become this crusader for the downtrodden. And when I expressed concern about that decision, she cut me off. She's been trying to punish me for not supporting her self-destructive choices ever since. Ruth stood up for cross-examination. Mr. Rossi, she said, were you aware of a trust fund established by your father in 1980 for your daughter Elena? I may have been aware of it, Dominic said carefully. But that trust was established before she was even born. It seemed more prudent to invest those funds in ways that would benefit the entire family. So you transferred money from the trust designed for your daughter into your own personal accounts without her knowledge or permission? I transferred funds that I felt could be better utilized by me, Dominic said. As trustee, that was within my authority. You weren't the trustee, Ruth said flatly. You were listed as a co-trustee, which means you required approval for major expenditures. You transferred approximately $847,000 without that approval. You forged signatures to make those transfers look legitimate. Is that correct? Dominic's face darkened. Those documents have been misrepresented. Yes or no, Mr. Rossi? Did you forge signatures? I adjusted documentation to reflect what I believed was the appropriate use of funds, Dominic said. You forged signatures, Ruth repeated. You committed fraud. And then you told your daughter she was ungrateful for the money you claimed to have spent on her when in fact you had stolen that money for your own use. Is that an accurate summary? Dominic's attorney objected, but the point had been made so clearly that it echoed through the courtroom. Everyone heard it. Everyone understood. Dominic Rossi had not just taken money. He had taken money and then weaponized that theft to make his daughter feel as though she owed him gratitude. The trial lasted 5 days. At the end of the 5th day, the judge issued her ruling. She found in my favor on all counts. She ordered my father to pay restitution of $1.9 million, plus interest plus court costs. She found that the documents my grandmother had gathered were authentic and accurate. She found that Dominic Rossi had committed fraud and that his actions constituted elder fraud, as he'd stolen from an account that was managed by his mother. She also issued a scathing statement from the bench about the manipulation and emotional cruelty that had accompanied the financial crimes. Mr. Rossi's behavior toward his daughter was not simply financial in nature, the judge said. It involved a deliberate pattern of devaluation and emotional abuse, designed to make her feel that she was unworthy of resources that belonged to her by right. That pattern makes these crimes more, not less, serious. I sat in that courtroom and I cried, but it wasn't the kind of crying I'd done in Richard's office. It was different. It was the sound of something breaking open and healing at the same time. But here's the thing about winning. It doesn't actually feel the way you think it's going to feel. My father did not accept the judgment. He appealed immediately. His lawyers filed for a stay, and while they pursued the appeal, he began a campaign of character assassination that was frankly impressive in its scope and creativity. He told people I'd manipulated my dying grandmother. He said I was mentally unstable and had constructed an elaborate fantasy. He claimed the documents were forged. He said I was destroying his reputation out of revenge because he'd refused to let me make destructive life choices. Some people believed him. Some people in my extended family cut off contact with me. Family gatherings split into factions, those who believed my father and those who believed me. My uncle Peter, my father's brother, stopped speaking to me entirely. Cousins I'd grown up with decided to stand with Dominic out of loyalty or fear, or maybe just out of the exhaustion that comes with picking sides in a family war. But other people believed me. My brothers, both of them ultimately, stood with me. My father's business partners started distancing themselves from him. Word travels in financial circles, and fraud is a contagious kind of embarrassment. Friends who'd known my family for years started asking questions, started seeing the patterns they'd missed before. And in the wider world, something unexpected happened. I didn't think about it at the time, but David suggested I write about what had happened. He said it might be helpful for my own processing, and he also said it might be useful if we had to go back to court for the appeal. So I wrote. I wrote about my childhood and my estrangement. I wrote about receiving my grandmother's letters and documents. I wrote about the trial and the judgment. I wrote about what it felt like to realize that the version of events I believed, That I was the problem, that I was ungrateful, that I was the one who didn't belong was a deliberate fiction constructed by the person who was supposed to protect me. I posted it anonymously on a blog. I expected maybe my friends to read it. I expected maybe it would help me process. Instead, it went viral. I don't fully understand why. Maybe it's because family betrayal is something so many people experience. Maybe it's because I wrote about the specific kind of manipulation that happens in families with money and power, the way emotional abuse and financial abuse are woven together. Maybe it's because I talked about the long road to believing yourself worthy of protection. But within 2 weeks, I had hundreds of thousands of people reading my story. Women who'd been told they were ungrateful. Men who'd had their worth measured by their financial productivity. Adult children estranged from their parents who needed to know that estrangement could be a form of self-protection, and not a moral failure. The story was picked up by major outlets. I did interviews. I became, quite unexpectedly, a public figure in the discourse around family trauma. And my father became even more furious, because now his crimes weren't just in a courtroom. They were in the public consciousness. The appeal was denied. It took 2 years, but the judgment was upheld. My father was ordered to pay the full amount plus additional penalties related to the appeals process. The criminal fraud case also proceeded, and he was convicted on 2 counts and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. He refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing until the very end. He was angry, vindictive, and convinced that the world had conspired against him. When he walked into the courthouse for his sentencing, he didn't look at me. He didn't acknowledge that I existed. I think that was the moment I finally understood that my father was not a person I could fix or reach or change. He was a person who had chosen a version of reality that required him to be the victim, and he would defend that version with every resource available to him until the day he died. And that was okay, because I'd stopped needing him to see me. I'd stopped needing him to validate my existence. I had other people for that now. The money came to me in a settlement arrangement. The house came to me completely. I sold the house and used those proceeds to pay off my student loans and start a therapy practice. I worked with other people who'd been estranged from family members, people who were navigating the complex grief of realizing that the people who were supposed to love them unconditionally had loved them conditionally or not at all. Marco became a real part of my life again. He went to therapy too, and we worked through the strange dynamic of having been pitted against each other our entire lives. We eventually came to a place where we could actually be siblings again, where we could be honest about the ways our father had shaped us and the ways we were working to become people who were shaped differently. Anthony never contacted me. As far as I know, he still believes our father's version of events, or he's chosen a middle ground of not thinking about it at all. I've made peace with that. I can't force him to see the truth. I can only live in a way that demonstrates what truth looks like when you stop being afraid of it. I want to tell you what my life is like now, 3 years after the trial. I work with families in crisis. I help people understand the patterns they're caught in. I help them see that they're not crazy and they're not ungrateful and they're not the problem, or more accurately, I help them understand their own role in their family narratives without taking on blame for things that were never theirs to carry. I have friends who love me. I have a partner who sees me and knows me and chooses me every day. I have money, and instead of being terrifying, it's grounding. It means I don't have to work jobs I hate. It means I can be generous with the people I care about. It means I can donate to causes that matter to me. I go to my grandmother's grave on her birthday and I tell her about my life. I tell her about the patients I've helped. I tell her about the mistakes I've made. I tell her about the ways I'm learning to be the kind of person she believed I could be. And sometimes I think about the weight of what she did for me. I think about the years she spent gathering evidence, the careful documentation of my father's crimes, the love that motivated her to stay silent for so long, and then finally, near the end of her life, to choose my protection over family loyalty. That's the kind of love that transforms you. That's the kind of love that makes you understand what being valued actually feels like. I know that some of you listening to this, reading this, will think I'm wrong. You'll think I should have forgiven my father. You'll think that family is sacred and that I should have tried harder to make it work. You'll think that money doesn't matter, and that I'm a terrible person for pursuing legal action against my own parent. And I hear you. I do. But what I want to tell you is this. Forgiveness is not something you owe to people who harmed you. Reconciliation is not required for healing. Family is not automatically worthy of your loyalty, And loyalty is not something you should give to people who use it to justify cruelty. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to choose your own healing over their comfort. You are allowed to let people experience the consequences of their actions. You are allowed to be the person your grandmother sees in you, even if your father cannot. If you're still listening, if any of this resonated with you, if you're sitting in your own version of this story where you're being told you're ungrateful for refusing to accept less, then I want you to know the story your family tells about you is not the truth of who you are. You are worth protecting. You were worth it when you were a child. You're worth it now. Your grandmother is watching you become who you're supposed to be. That's what I'd want you to know.